now that what was wrong was something greater than a hallucination or a hangover. He was in some kind of trap. His first thought was to rush home and see if Helen was there. There was a great sense of relief when he thought of her. Helen, with her grave blue eyes and understanding manner, would listen to him and know what was the matter. He left the haunted drugstore at a run, darted around the corner, and up the street to his car. But though he had not locked the car, the door resisted his twisting grasp. Shaking, pounding, swearing, Miller wrestled with each of the doors. Abruptly, he stiffened as a horrible thought leaped into his being. His gaze left the car and wandered up the street. Past the intersection, past the one beyond that, on up the thoroughfare until the gray haze of the city dimmed everything. And as far as Dave Miller could see, there was no trace of motion. Cars were poised in the street, some passing other machines, some turning corners. A streetcar stood at a safety zone. A man who had leaped from the bottom step hung in space a foot above the pavement. Pedestrians paused with one foot up. A bird hovered above a telephone pole, its wings glued to the blue vault of the sky. With a choked sound, Miller began to run. He did not slacken his pace for 15 minutes, until around him were the familiar, reassuring trees and shrub-bordered houses of his own street. But yet, how strange to him. The season was autumn, and the air filled with brown and golden leaves that tossed on a frozen wind. Miller ran by two boys lying on a lawn, petrified into a modern counterpart of the sculptor's The Wrestlers. The sweetish tang of burning leaves brought a thrill of terror to him, for, looking down an alley from whence the smoke drifted, he saw a man tending a fire whose leaping flames were red tongues that did not move. Sobbing with relief, the young druggist started up on his own walk. He tried the front door, found it locked, and jammed a thumb against the doorbell. But of course the little metal button was as immovable as a mountain. So in the end, after convincing himself that the key could not be inserted into the lock, he sprang toward the back. The screen door was not latched, but it might as well have been the steel door of a bank vault. Miller began to pound on it, shouting, "Helen! Helen! Are you in there? My God, dear, there's something wrong. You've got to..." The silence that flowed in again when his voice choked off was the dead stillness of the tomb. He could hear his voice rustling through the empty rooms, and at last it came back to him like a taunt. "Helen! Helen!" Chapter 2. Time Stands Still. For Dave Miller, the world was now a planet of death on which he alone lived and moved and spoke. Staggered, utterly beaten, he made no attempt to break into his home. But he didn't stumble around to the kitchen window and try to peer in, anxious to see if there was a body on the floor. The room was in semi-darkness, however, and his straining eyes made out nothing. He returned to the front of the house, shambling like a somnambulist. Seated on the porch steps, head in hands, he slipped into a hell of regrets. He knew now that his suicide had been no hallucination. He was dead, all right, and this must be hell or purgatory. Bitterly, he cursed his drinking that had led him to such a mad thing as suicide. Suicide! He, Dave Miller, a coward who had just taken his own life. Miller's whole being crawled with revulsion. If he just had the last year to live over again, he thought fervently. And yet, through it all, some inner strain kept trying to tell him he was not dead. This was his own world, all right, and essentially unchanged. What had happened to it was beyond the pale of mere guesswork. But this one thing began to be clear. This was a world in which change or motion of any kind was a foreigner. Fire would not burn, and smoke did not rise. Doors would not open. Liquids were solid. Miller's stubbing toe could not move a pebble, and a blade of grass easily supported his weight without bending. In other words, Miller began to understand, change had been stopped as surely as if a master hand had put a finger on the world's balance wheel. Miller's ramblings were terminated by the consciousness that he had an acute headache. His mouth tasted, as Herman used to say after a big night, as if an army had camped in it. Coffee and a bromo were what he needed. But it was a great awakening to him when he found a restaurant and learned that he could neither drink the coffee nor get the lid off the bromo bottle. Fragrant coffee steam hung over the glass percolator, but even this steam was as a brick wall to his probing touch. Miller started gloomily to thread his way through the waiters in back of the counter again. Moments later, he stood in the street, and there were tears swimming in his eyes. "Helen!" His voice was a pleading whisper. "Helen, honey, where are you?" There was no answer, but the pitiful palpitation of utter silence. And then there was movement at Dave Miller's right. Something shot from between the parked cars and crashed against him, something brown and hairy and soft. It knocked him down. Before he could get his breath, a red, wet tongue was licking his face and hands, and he was looking up into the face of a police dog. Frantic with joy at seeing another in this city of death, the dog would scarcely let Miller rise. It stood up to plant big wet paws on his shoulders and try to lick his face. Miller laughed out loud, a laugh with a throaty catch in it. "Where'd you come from, boy?" he asked. "Won't they talk to you either? What's your name, boy?" There was a heavy brass-studded collar about the animal's neck, and Dave Miller read on its little nameplate, "Major." "Well, Major, at least we've got company now," was Miller's sigh of relief. For a long time he was too busy with the dog to bother about the sobbing noises. Apparently the dog failed to hear them, for he gave no sign. Miller scratched him behind the ear. "What shall we do now, Major? Walk? Maybe your nose can smell out another friend for us." They had gone hardly 2 blocks when it came to him that there was a more useful way of spending their time. The library. Half convinced that the whole trouble stemmed from his suicide shot in the head, which was conspicuously absent now, he decided that a perusal of the surgery books in the public library might yield something he could use. That way they bent their steps, and were soon mounting the broad cement stairs of the building. As they went beneath the brass turnstile, the librarian caught Miller's attention with a smiling glance. He smiled back. "I'm trying to find something on brain surgery," he explained. With a shock then, he realized he had been talking to himself. In the next instant, Dave Miller whirled. A voice from the bookcases chuckled, "If you find anything, I wish you'd let me know. I'm stumped myself." From a corner of the room came an elderly, half-bald man with tangled gray brows and a rueful smile. A pencil was balanced over his ear, and a notebook was clutched in his hand. "Me too," he said. "I had hoped I was the only one." Miller went forward hurriedly to grip his hands. "I'm afraid I'm not so unselfish," he admitted. "I've been hoping for 2 hours that I'd run into some other poor soul." "Quite understandable," the stranger murmured sympathetically, "but in my case it is different. You see, I am responsible for this whole tragic business." "You?" Dave Miller gulped the word. I thought." The man wagged his head, staring at his notepad, which was littered with jumbled calculations. Miller had a chance to study.